Class 10, Supplementary English, Chapter 1, A Triumph of Surgery, Part 2. Good morning, children. So, today we are going to continue with the second part of the lesson, A Triumph of Surgery. Yesterday, we have seen that the surgeon was giving some advice to Mrs. Pumphrey, and we have also seen that Mrs. Pumphrey has pampered the dog to such a great extent that the dog was looking and feeling very sick. Now, let us see what the surgeon is going to do with the dog. At the surgery, the household of dogs surged round me. Round me. Who is me? The writer, the surgeon. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes. When put down, lay motionless on the carpet. So, Tricky is very insipid. It's like a dead body. Looked down at a noisy pack with dull eyes, and Tricky was laying motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So, the other dogs did not pay any attention to the insipid dog, that is, Tricky. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in the surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. So, you see some change in Tricky. And what was the treatment given to Tricky? Was he given any medicine? No. The only thing that was given to Tricky was plenty of water. Alright? And no food. When he was given no food but only water, he started improving. He started to show some signs of interest in the things around him. And on the third day, he began to show signs in the whimpering herd of other dogs. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Tricky is, of course, still fat. He cannot reduce his fat in 3 days, but he started taking interest in the game of the dogs, the other dogs. He played with the dogs. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. Feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was a usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. That means when the food was given by the man, all the dogs will rush to it and they will start eating very fast. High-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. So, why are the dogs eating so fast? The dogs are eating so fast because they have to finish their share. If they are slow, other dogs might come and attack his bowl. And so, there was a kind of a competition if any food is left in their bowls. That's why they ate very fast. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside 1 or 2 of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. That means he was not given much food. He started licking the other bowls. He wanted more food. So the next day he was given 1 more serving. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medical treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being bowled over, tramped on, and squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtimes and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. So he was able to see a great difference, and he enjoyed the difference. He was pampered by Mrs. Pumphrey, but now he is playing with the dogs. He was bowled over, tramped on, squashed every moment, and he enjoyed it. He ran hunting the rats in the old hen house at night. Before, he never had such a lovely time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. The bulletins of the improvement in Tricky, how Tricky was doing. I dodged a question about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat was worn according to weather. I dodged the question. He tried to avoid answering these questions because in his place, he did not need any such thing. He did not need to change his bowls nor change his coats and cushions. So the writer dodged the questions. He avoided answering these questions. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. So this is the truth, that he is progressing, he is recovering, and that was a question he answered, but he avoided the rest. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring a round of fresh eggs, 2 dozen at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situations began to dawn on the household. So, Mrs. Pumphrey began to think that Tricky needed more food, and so she brought fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up the strength of Tricky, and she also brought bottles of wine. Okay, and the writer and his friends started enjoying the food which is given for Tricky. The food which is given to Tricky is too rich, even rich for human beings. And so the writer started enjoying the food which is given for Tricky. Obviously, he did not have as much as Tricky had. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. What is this? To enrich Tricky's blood? The bottles of wine, okay? Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So, the man and his friends started enjoying his lunch. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. Even brandy arrived. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. There were days of deep content. Those days when Tricky stayed with him. Those were the days of deep content, starting well with extra eggs in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. So whatever that has been given for Tricky has been taken by the doctor. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. It was a temptation to keep Tricky with him, because with Tricky around, he was going to get eggs and brandy and wine. And he was having a good time. So he wanted to keep Tricky forever with him. But he cannot do that. On the other side, the lady is suffering a lot without Tricky. And so she had to be told that The dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, it did not take much time. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" So within minutes, she arrived to collect the dog. And very anxiously, she asked, Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was a little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, heart-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack stretching out in the great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. So, within 2 weeks, you could see a really healthy, muscular dog. He was keeping up well with the pack. He was able to get along well with the other dogs, stretching out in great bounds and his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arm in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh," and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. So the dog was equally excited to see Mrs. Pumphrey, and when he saw the mistress, he jumped out of the arms of our surgeon and rushed to her and started licking her face all over. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, and bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So Mrs. Pumphrey showed her gratitude by telling Mr. Harriet that she did not have enough words to thank him. She was so thankful. And she added, "This is a triumph of surgery." So this is what surgery has done. What is the triumph? What is the triumph here? The triumph here is the improved condition of Tricky. And she thinks that surgery had done it. But we know, this is the irony behind the lines, we know that the surgeon had not done any kind of surgery. He had not conducted any kind of operation. The only thing he had done is cutting down the diet of Tricky. And that is the reason behind the improved condition of Tricky. So the last lines are very ironic. This is a triumph of surgery. There had been no surgery of any kind, but she feels that surgery had done the miracle. So this is all. Now, since we have come to the end of our lesson, I'm going to give you 2 questions for you to write as homework. The first question is, what physical change could be seen in Tricky? What physical change could be seen in Tricky? And the second question is, comment on the last 2 lines of the story. Comment on the last 2 lines of the story. Now, this is all for today. Thank you and have a good day. Please do your homework.